So I've populated my city with just a little bit more information, just for reference, so that I can create a couple of still frames, and that kind of feature my city the way that I want it to, and then also to create a simple animation. So of course I don't feel like my city is complete. I have a lot more work to do on it, but I wanted to get the kind of the final concepts for this project to you, so that you could implement those concepts to wrap up the project presentation. So, of course, when it comes to the still frames, you can manage this the same way that you manage the previous projects. The preferred way to deal with this, of course, is to go into render settings, to make sure that you're setting your output to an appropriate size. And I could do something like screen or video. I'll stick to screen because I won't get any kind of distortion if I choose a video setting that could disproportionately scale this. So, if I wanted something fairly high res, I could choose the 1280 by 1024. The higher the resolution, of course, the larger price we'll pay for the render times. So I'd recommend a minimum of 1024 by 768 in terms of the still renders that you intend to submit for this project. And once those are set, of course, you can go into the save option and choose your format. You could indicate where you want this file saved, or you could simply just render to the picture viewer by clicking on this center render button. It'll calculate the render, and you can manage the render from this window. So, just a slightly different workflow at this point. So I'll give this a pause. Well, it looks like it's wrapping up the render, but let's say this is a render that I want to keep and I want to submit. Now, from a compositional standpoint, this is not the project that I want to submit, but it gives me an idea of what I'm working on here. So once I've captured that render, you'll notice that as you keep rendering, you're going to get additional versions that are popping up in this history. And this is the only version that I've rendered since I've had this file open. So this is the version that I will select. And I could either choose to click to save this or do a quick file save as. And then I could choose the file type that I want to render, whether it's a still image, and choose all these different parameters. And when I hit OK, it'll prompt me to save this in an appropriate location. Of course, I could save that in my project folder as a PNG or a JPEG, and then I can use that to post it as a work in progress. Now, I'll close the picture viewer here, and I'll just change my format just a little bit. And for the sake of the demo, I'm going to turn off global illumination so it renders a little bit faster. And I'll just do a quick render to picture viewer. You'll see that it's calculating the render, and now it's captured that render. And so now I have a second version over here that's rendered. This is the first version with the global illumination turned on and an alternate perspective. I'll select the second version, and if I want to save this version out, I could simply do a quick file save as, choose the appropriate file format. I'll choose a JPEG this time around. I'll let everything else default, making sure that the image type is still image, format is JPEG, everything else should be just fine, and I'll say OK. Of course, I can save that in an appropriate location. I'll just save this out quickly to my desktop rather than the project folder, and now this is something that I can pick up and post as my work in progress. So again, you have a lot of options when it comes to managing and saving the individual renders. This is the method that I prefer to work with the individual renders, is as we're working, as long as the render settings are set the way that we want them, and if we're looking through the appropriate camera, you can just simply click on that center render button. It'll render to the picture viewer. Now, one thing to note is that I'm viewing my image at 100%, and in this case, my picture viewer window is smaller than the actual image render. That's because I chose 1024 by 768, and if I want to zoom out, I could use these controls, this drop-down menu here, to kind of zoom in and zoom out and see what my composition is. But just be mindful of the resolution that you're rendering to and the resolution that you're submitting to. The final renders for this image should be around 1024 by 768. You can go higher if you want to. When it comes to animation, I want to create just a real simple animation of a fly-through, maybe down the city street, or maybe I want to kind of fly around a corner or something like that. There's a couple of different ways to do this, and I'll share with you the easiest way to do this, which is I'm just going to generate a camera. So I have a individual camera inside this scene. Now, just remember from the previous presentations, particularly the desk scene, I covered the concept of using multiple cameras to remember your individual views. So if you find a composition that you want to get back to, the easiest thing to do is just generate a camera. And from that perspective view, that camera adopts the view that you're in. So just as I did now, I created a camera and it borrowed the view that I'm looking through. So now, of course, if I activate that camera, and I'll just go over here to the object manager, and if I just click on that little white bracket or that black bracket there on the right side of the camera, it'll turn white. Once it's white, that means that I'm actually looking through, my camera is active. Okay, if I toggle that button, again, I'm outside the camera, no longer looking at it. Now, I want to animate this camera just the same way that I did in the previous presentation animating the cube. And it's just a really simple matter of making sure that my playhead is at the point where I want the animation to start. So again, if I want the first frame of the animation, the camera to start moving, I could just advance the playhead back to the beginning of time. If I want to pause a little bit at the front end of the animation and start a little bit later, which isn't a bad idea, maybe I'll start my playhead at frame 20. Now, if I mark that first keyframe, I can advance the playhead later in time, and again, I'll stop maybe a few frames shy of the last frame so I don't get an abrupt end, so I have kind of a pause at the end of my animation. I'll advance the playhead. I'll change the position of the camera, so I'm just moving that through space. Okay, and I'll correct for this as I'm driving that through the environment, so I'm just making sure that I'm not flying through any buildings or anything. I'll mark that last keyframe, and I'll just kind of scrub the playhead back and forth to see what that camera is doing. It looks like it's flying down the street. That looks pretty good. Now I'll look through the camera. I'll activate that camera, so now I'm actually looking through the camera, and I could advance the playhead. There it goes, and now I'm flying down my city street. So, and if I wanted to throw in a rotation there and start to look in a different direction, I can do that just the same way that I demonstrated in the previous presentation. Now, in addition to animating with that method, I'm gonna exit the camera. There is one other method that you can animate and look through the camera, and then I'll cover the basics of rendering out this animation. An alternate method of animating the camera is rather than animating outside the camera. So, the example that I just used was I created this camera and I treated it just like an object, like the previous presentation, where we record the first keyframe with the camera selected, we advance it through space, advance the playhead, advance the camera through space, and update that keyframe. Now, I'm treating it just like an object, just like I did with the cube. Now, another method is thinking about this a little bit different, and that's looking through the actual camera that you're animating. So I just introduced a second camera. I'm going to look through that new camera. So I'm actually inside the camera. Now, if you've activated the camera, once you start to zoom in and zoom out and pan and orbit and do all those things, you're actually moving the camera. So just to demonstrate this point, right now I'm inside this camera. Camera 1, it's activated. If I deactivate it, I'll just back up and look at this camera. This is camera 1. This is the camera I was looking through. It's kind of up and away. Now if I look through this camera again, and I zoom way in and I jump back out of the camera, you can see that I've moved that camera through space. So whenever you're looking through a camera, whenever you pan, orbit, rotate, move your perspective view, just like we have been as we model, you're actually moving the camera. So we can take advantage of this and say, okay, I want this to be my establishing shot for the opening animation. And I want this to start to move maybe at frame 10. So I'm actually inside the camera. It's important that the camera is selected and it's active. Okay, so those two things are true. I have the camera selected and it's active. I'm going to advance the playhead to frame 20. Excuse me, frame 10 in this case, I think I'll start with. And I'm going to record the keyframe. So I've just recorded camera 1, the camera we're looking through, in its current position at frame 10. Now I'm going to advance the playhead to frame 80, and I'm going to change my position. So I'm just zooming in, I'll orbit, I'll pan over, and I'll fly right under this light. I'll move up a little bit, there we go. And I'll record the keyframe. Now I'll scrub my playhead back, and you can see that now I'm flying through the building, which is not at all what I wanted to do. but I have the basic wireframe of the animation. So I'm flying in, and I'm flying straight through this building and then underneath that light. Well, what I want to do is I want to correct this animation a little bit. And so I'm going to advance the playhead and say, okay, well, right about here, I actually want to start to be more in line with the street. So I'm just advancing the playhead a little bit. I still have camera 1 selected, and I'm still looking through it, and I'll just continue to modify this. So I'm just going to orbit. I'll change my perspective a bit. That looks pretty good. And I'll mark a keyframe. Now I've just updated the animation path of this camera. Now I'll scrub the playhead. And now this is the result. So now I'm kind of swooping in down the street, and now I go flying down the street. So there's the basic animation path. I'm looking through camera 1, and maybe I'll even name this this camera. This is my bird's eye or my bird flyby camera, or simply maybe I'll just call it flyby. This is my flyby camera. Okay. So I now have a simple animation, or at least a simple animated setup that I can then render. In order to render this animation, I have a couple of different options, and I'll share with you the easiest option to render out an animation. So I definitely want to make sure that I save. I'm going to save, and I'm going to do a file save incremental. So I've recorded all the cameras. Maybe I have my render settings just the way that I want, but I want to continue to experiment with this. Well, for the sake of the demo, I'm just going to jump in and make sure that my global illumination is turned off and that I don't have too many features turned on, because I want to render this fairly quickly. Now, I have 90 frames of animation, okay, because Cinema 4D provided me with 90 frames and I used all of them. That's 3 seconds of animation. What I want to do is I want to go up to the center render button and click and hold on that and choose to make preview. Now, when I make preview, I get a little dialog box that pops up, and basically what this is going to do is it gives us just some really simple options. We want a full render. Alternatives are software preview and hardware preview, and the difference is, basically we're looking at a software preview right now, so we get a really fast render. For the sake of the demo, I'll do a full render, but I'll pause this once it starts to render, and I have the choice to render all frames. Okay, now remember, I'm using frames 0 through 90, so I could choose a preview range if I wanted just to set, just a couple of frames to render, or if I manually wanted to render frames, say 30 to 60, just to see what the middle of the animation looks like. But in this case, I'll render all frames. I have the choice about the size of my render, and this 320 pixels is the default for the preview, and that's just a little kind of postcard, even postage stamp size render, just a very small render. It's 320 by 240 pixels. If I decided to bump this up to something like 480 maybe, oops, didn't want to do that. Let me close that window. Try that again. I didn't mean to hit return. I'll make preview. I definitely want to cancel what I'm doing. You can see that when I typed in 480 and I changed my dialog box, it updated the proportion of the render. So if this was 360 to begin with, or 320 I believe it was, when I change the dialog box, it snaps back to the proportion. So I'm going to pay a smaller price the smaller the format for this, but for the render that I want to submit, I want to do at least 480. Maybe I even want to do something a little bit higher resolution, like 640. And you can see that if I do a 640 by 480 render at a frame rate of 30 frames per second, I'll let that all default. The only other option that I need to choose, if I want to, is I want to go into my options. Now these are my QuickTime options, and really the only thing that I want to point out here is that the compression type by default is called animation. And for those of you that have worked in video or animation before, animation is individual uncompressed frames, which isn't a bad thing, but it's going to create a really huge file. And if we click in here, we have all these different codecs that we can choose from, for various different kinds of output. It's not really important. It's a little outside the scope to talk about each one of these, but a really nice codec that's simple, it's small yet high quality, is this H.264. I'm going to choose H.264. It's going to give me a really good quality, a fairly small file size, and things like YouTube and Vimeo like this file type quite a bit. So I'll hit OK. I'll hit OK once again, and you can see down here in the bottom left-hand corner, it's calculating the preview. Now, right now the preview is being rendered to my picture viewer. Okay, and let's see if I can open this picture viewer up. There it is. So you can see it's preparing the render here, and it's gonna work. Actually, I kind of faked out the picture viewer. When I went back to the picture viewer, it actually just rendered a still frame. So I'm going to need to do that one more time. I'm going to go back to make preview. So the make preview is actually calculating in the background, and I really don't need to cancel this because you can see down here in the bottom left-hand corner, it's calculating, or it's rendering. It's getting ready to render the preview. And when it's done, it's going to open it up in the picture viewer for me. So again, that process is once I have my animated camera set up, I got to make sure that I'm looking through my camera, make sure it's active, because making the preview will use the active view. The next thing I'll do is go under make preview, and from make preview, I'll adjust things accordingly, and I'll hit OK. And then I get this little status bar here. When this is done, this will open up in the picture viewer, and from there we can save it out as a QuickTime movie. I'll pause this and reactivate the screen capture once that's up and ready to save, so I'll catch up with you here shortly. Okay, so here's the finished render. We can hit the play button over here in the bottom right-hand corner, and you can see a preview of the render. Obviously, it runs a little fast, so that 3-second animation is a little fast for the distance that I'm trying to cover, but that gives me a pretty good sense of what my environment looks like. So now what I can do at this point is give this a quick save, and I'll choose to do a file save as. And what I want to do is I want to make sure that I'm not just saving out a still render. I want to make sure that I'm saving out the entire animation. So what I'm going to do is do from the file type, I'm going to do animation. The format I'm going to choose all the way down at the bottom. I'm going to choose to save it out as a QuickTime. Everything else I should be okay to let it default, and I'll do a quick OK to save it. It prompts me to decide to make a decision about where I'm going to save this. I'll save it right to the desktop. Currently, the default save as name is preview, and I'll let that default for now, but I'll change it before I submit it through Blackboard or upload it to YouTube or Vimeo. So I'll give that a quick file save as, and once that option spits out, I'll just jump out. Here's my preview. I can double click and open that in QuickTime. It'll do a quick conversion on it. At least in my case it will. And so here's my QuickTime movie. Now this is ready to be uploaded, and I'll give this, I'll just close it, and you'll see that QuickTime is asking me to change it because it had to convert a couple of the parameters, and I'll just save this right over top of, or I'll save it right to my desktop. So there it is, desktop, and I'll just give that a quick save. It created an alternative with the converted nomenclature here, and I'll just call this Bill's Flyby, and I'll just keep the extension .mov. Now this is something that rather than attaching this to Blackboard, and it's not really that big of a deal, it's only 28 megabytes, so it's not too huge, so shouldn't have any problem submitting this through Blackboard, but an alternative is to upload this file to YouTube or Vimeo and just include the link inside Blackboard. So it's going to be much more efficient to submit this as a link than it will the entire movie. But take a crack at creating a flyby or some kind of presentation video. Maybe you'll create your city on a turntable to show all different angles of it, and create some still frames and present those both in the discussion board and submit those through the assignment link. So that's it. I'll wrap up the presentation from here. I will continue to add to the tips and tricks section and cover some odds and ends for this project and answer any questions that you might have. But for the most part, I think you have everything that you need to wrap up this project successfully. So have fun with it. Post works in progress and your final post to the discussion board.